Associate Professor of Wildland Fire here at UW-SP. It's a brand new program, and we are proud to host Matt Jolly and John Hintz. John is with the Wisconsin DNR, and as many of you know, he's been piloting the Live Fuels Moisture Project, being weighing fuels for, what did you say?
14 years.
14 years, something like that. And
13 or 14. I lost count.
Lost count, okay. So he's the area forestry staff specialist with Wisconsin DNR out of Wisconsin Rapids. He's got a BS in forest management from UW-Stevens Point, and began his career in 1984 as a forest ranger at the Kashina Ranger Station in Menominee, with Menominee. So he works with all aspects of forestry and fire control programs currently. Has really been interested in the things that Matt Jolly's been doing in terms of live fuel moisture. Matt Jolly, I've actually known Matt for some time. I ran across him when I was in Florida. But Matt's one of these, Matt's a great thinker. He's actually from North Carolina, so I can understand him when he talks, and he can understand me actually. So outdoorsman, a great thinker, really has a different perspective on fire and on fuels. He understands the things that are going on inside the fuel, and that's what he's going to be talking to us about in terms of the spring dip. So just kind of a little bit of housekeeping. When we do take a break, restrooms are straight down the hallway, not the first hallway, but the second one over. Go straight down. The women's restroom is first, and then on at the end of the hallway is the men's restroom. So if you need those facilities. Any questions, ask me. I'll be glad to help direct you somewhere. And if I can't help you, I'll get a graduate student to help you, so they're always beneficial. So kind of the agenda, John is going to introduce the topic, why it's important, the relevance to fire management in the Lake States, and then Matt is going to talk about kind of the nitty-gritty. So this is going to be our agenda, and I wanted to say afterwards there's going to be a workshop on the actual measuring of live fuel moisture, looking at the density kit and the things involved with that, and it'll be up in 361 in a laboratory. So without much ado, turn it over to you, John.
All right. Thanks, Ron. Well, what we're going to do here today is start out with talk about the history. How do we get here to this study? Like Ron said, I've been actually working with this project in one form or another since 2003 when I got to Wisconsin Rapids as area staff specialist over there. Jim Bernier, who's here in the audience, and John Schwingle, and a couple other folks who had been involved in kind of a prototype of this study back in 2001, 2002, but because of their job duties, they couldn't really do it to the extent that sampling required. I got there, my PD didn't require me to do initial attack work, so I was able to devote some time to developing this study a little bit more. So we'll talk a little bit about the history. I started tracking and asking our rangers to track the fire behavior that they were seeing in the fires in the Wisconsin Rapids area, which is Juneau, Adams, Wood, Portage, and Marathon counties, beginning back in 2003. And so what we have here is the chart shows the red bars are the worst fire behavior that people were seeing on fires on a given day through that period of time, 2003 to 14. And the green bars are the total number of fires through those years that have occurred on those dates. And what we see here is real surprising. Those of us who are in fire know that that area in the yellow box there tends to be where we see a lot of our worst fire behavior. So we're quantifying here that, yeah, what we perceive is real. We're really seeing this. Now we know that spring is the worst time for forest fires in Wisconsin, in the Lake States. We've known that for decades. But we also know that between that period of snow melt and green up, there's a period when it's particularly bad. And in identifying that through the decades, there's a lot of colloquial stuff that has come around. as to when is it really the worst. Well, last week of April, first week of May. My favorite one is when the oak leaves are as big as a squirrel's ear, then you know it's really going to be bad out there. Up in Canada, they use them when the bracken ferns are popping and the pines are going to crown. Just a couple of these colloquial things that we use to pinpoint when things are going to be their worst. It works, but it doesn't really refine things. Is it really scientific? So again, we know from this chart here is a well-established, documented history and studies that have shown that in the spring of the year, you have a dip in the fuel moisture content of the pine foliage, or for that matter, just about any species. And so we know that that happens, and we know that it seems to correlate with somewhat with fire behavior. We want to figure out, is there any way to refine this even more, figure out if there's any weather trends we can correlate it with, soil trends, whatever it might be that could explain what and better predict when things are going to be bad. So that's how I got into this back in 2003. We started taking samples, and this is a chart of our red pine sampling from 2003 to 2012. And yep, our data supports what the literature shows. Yep, we have this spring dip. And then I plotted here 4 of the worst fires in our last 30 years of history. And yep, lo and behold, they pretty much match that dip period when things are at their lowest. This is with red pine. We're able to kind of say that below about 100% fuel moisture, we're getting torching in the red pines, generally speaking. Below 95%, we have greater tendency to crown under the right conditions. So we're kind of beginning to see some trends and put some numbers to the behavior. Looking at jack pine, we see similar thing. You know, the dip is pretty pronounced in the same period. We couldn't really refine it more than to say that below about 105% we're seeing more torching and crowning. So we're kind of able to refine it somewhat, but we want to know if we can get any better at it. And what we're also finding is that fuel moisture alone didn't explain some situations, like in the middle of the summer. This was 2012. This fire you see here, the Smoky Spur fire in Portage County, about 10 miles away from here. It was a droughty summer, very dry. But the fire occurred on August 3rd, and these, the red and the green lines here are jack pine and red pine fuel moistures. As you can tell, they're just about at their peak. So clearly this crowning situation, where the ranger said this crowned almost instantly when the fire burned out of the field into the pines. Clearly fuel moisture alone doesn't explain all the behavior. Drought conditions obviously figure into that, but we want to know, is there any more science that we can apply to this and try and refine things more? So then came a confluence of lucky events. In December of 2012, Matt Jolly from the Missoula Fire Lab was giving a webinar through the Lake States Fire Consortium talking about a similar study of fuel moistures in lodgepole pine. And we had some exchange after that with our leadership in Madison, myself, and Matt. And Matt was interested in looking at our spring dip phenomena here in the Lake States. So we eventually started a project, began in 2013. We started sending or collecting samples and processing them for a more expanded study and analysis of what was going on. And it was in cooperation with the Lake States Fire Consortium and UW-StevensPoint here with Ron Masters and his program. In 2014, Minnesota DNR and the Huron-Manistee National Forest started taking samples and contributing data. And in 2014, the Great Lakes Forest Fire Compact started providing funding to support this for the Great Lakes states members of the compact. And then this year, Michigan DNR is going to begin doing sampling in the Upper Peninsula out of Marquette. So we've expanded this thing now to across the Upper Great Lakes. All the red dots here are the red stars are where we're doing what we call full suite sampling, where we're looking at needle density, chemistry, physical properties of the needles, and the flammability studies. and the blue triangles are areas that are collecting data, supportive data that just looks at fuel moisture content, or foliar moisture content, I'm sorry. We now have a pretty good geographic range, both latitude and longitude-wise, through our pine forest in the lake states. So, as I said, at the full suite sites, as we call them, we do needle density and foliar moisture content locally. We send needle samples out for chemical analysis in Pennsylvania, and Matt's lab in Missoula does flammability analysis up there. And we're trying to capture that geographic variability across the Great Lakes area. Our goal then, as it says here, is to identify the factors that explain the increase in flammability, and then, more importantly, can we predict it? Can we have a better way to model it so we can predict it and know more precisely than the oak leaves that are as big as a squirrel's ear? Know better than that how to predict when things are going to be really bad out there in our pine forest on a given day. So to that end, I turn it over to Matt to tell you what we've learned through his pulling it all together.
How's everybody doing today? I'm a little groggy, so my voice is a little raspy, and I apologize. We're going to get through this just fine. My name is Matt Jolly. I'm a research ecologist at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. We get to set things on fire and study them and get paid for it. It's the best job ever. Several years ago, we started trying to understand what makes green things burn. In its simplest case, there were a lot of things that just didn't make sense. We throw around this metric of fuel moisture all the time and use it to describe whether or not a green needle or a green plant is flammable, but we never actually put it into context in terms of what that number is telling us throughout the year and what are driving those changes in that number. When I did the webinar for the Great Lakes Fire Science Consortium, and John was listening in, that was like a turning point, because none of us would be here today if it hadn't been for John's interest in this initial part of the study, because he picked up this idea and just ran with it. He's been absolutely phenomenal. And I think you know, the things that we've already learned are owed in a large part to him and to his interest and his ability to help with this study. So I'm definitely thankful for that, John. But really, what we're trying to get to is we'll just start on here. I've always been fascinated in how our history, meaning the people that have come before us, shape our perspective or our interpretation of what we see. It's almost like that I put down here that says, that's what people have always told me, so it must be true. Being a scientist, our job is to always evaluate our assumptions, is to kind of understand that underpinning of whether or not we're really basing our opinions of what we see on fact, things that we can actually measure. In 1959, Byron published this quote, which is almost poetic. It says, "The effect of fuel moisture on the burning rate of wood fuel is pronounced and so obvious that no measurements are needed to illustrate its overall effect." That simple statement tells you that it must be all about moisture content. It must be all about fuels. And if you've ever had to make a campfire or actually start any kind of fire outside or anything to do with fire, you know that wet wood doesn't burn. It just doesn't. But The interesting thing is that this simple statement naturally puts us on this trajectory of saying, well, it must be all about moisture content. So the tools that most fire managers use in the federal service for assessing the growth of a fire, models that are built on lab experiments actually done in our lab, were all done in dead fuels. It was either dead pine needles or shredded up aspen, called Excelsior. So they go through this series of experiments and they say, look, we can modify the fuel moisture. We can see that the fire spreads slower when the fuels are wetter. We can see that it actually self-extinguishes when it gets too wet. So it must be all about moisture. So when they went to incorporate live fuels into this model, they said, well, they said that live fuels are basically just really wet dead fuels. So it's like, but we're not talking a little bit wetter. So has anyone ever measured a live fuel moisture? John? Yeah, well, we know you have. But so let's just put this into perspective. What are the differences in live fuel moisture versus dead fuels? A typical live fuel moisture is 100%. That means that it has exactly the same amount of water as it has dry weight of fuel. A typical dead fuel moisture is about 10%. So there's a factor of 10 difference in the moisture content of these fuels. Yet somehow, some way, green plants burn, and they burn with high intensity. Why is that? Because there's some things we just don't know, but we're learning more about every day. So basically this all assumes that we know what live fuel moisture is in the first place. And I think we're getting to a new place though. So John gave a good introduction, but you know, I think it's always nice to put this into perspective in terms of where it matters. In addition to the lake states, jack pine especially is distributed throughout a lot of the Canadian provinces, but the distribution of both of them cover a fair amount of the northeastern U.S. and the lake states, so it's not a localized kind of distribution. But really what we wanted to do with this study is to figure out what the main drivers of the spring dip are, and tie them to things that we could actually measure and explain, and but also to assess their potential impact on fire behavior. And then finally to get to a point where we could actually develop some tools that we could use to say, these are our conditions today. Is this a day that's likely to have high potential for a crown fire? So we're getting to that point slowly but surely. So in 1967, Van Wagner published this the paper, Seasonal Variations in Moisture Content of Eastern Canadian Tree Foliage and Possible Effect on Crown Fire. And he documented this phenomenon referred to as the spring dip. So the dormant season fuel moistures are somewhere around 100, between 115 and 125%. And then we see this increase or this decrease in fuel moisture right up to just about late May, early June. There are some things that you should notice about this. So one is that this dip period just so happens to correspond to the exact timing of the flushing of new needles. That's important. I want you to hang on to that for me. So as the dip decreases to its minimum, then all of a sudden new needles show up. The new needle moisture content's very high, 300% or higher, and then declines monotonically until they're about the same by the end of the season. He showed that the moisture content has an effect on the radiant intensity of the fire, So basically, fires with a lower moisture content are not, their radiation isn't being absorbed by the water vapor that's generated by the fire. That may or may not be the actual mechanism, but it's supporting, it does have some effect on what actually drives the fire spread. But I want to refer to this equation. I didn't say there'd be no math, did I? Because that's just wrong. This is easy. The fuel moisture in its simplest form is basically just how much water does it have versus how much dry weight does it have. So if we measure fuel moisture, we go out, we collect something, we bring it back, we weigh it, we put it in an oven, and we dry it completely out, and then we weigh it again. Well, that gives us two things. It gives us the weight of the water in the fuel, and it gives us the dry weight of the fuel. Well, if you are a dead log in the forest, and you're in a place where decomposition is slow, your dry weight doesn't change very much. So that means that any fluctuation in the moisture content is directly determined by the weather. So the weather creates the environment around the outside of the log that either drives moisture in or sucks moisture out. Rainfall can wet that fuel, or rainfall can actually replenish a deficit in that fuel. But live fuels are alive. They are different. They are different in ways that are very hard to understand sometimes. But a live plant's whole job is two things. Is to conserve water and to grow. And that complicating factor is why we don't really know what we're measuring. Because this water weight is dynamically determined by the ability of the plant to shut down when the evaporative demand is high, but it also, the dry weight of the plant is also determined by how much it's growing, so how much it's photosynthesizing. So these two things in ratio are what actually gives us live fuel moisture. So imagine this. If you assume that the water content, the absolute amount of water in the plant is the same throughout the season, and the only thing you varied was the dry weight of the plant, what would happen? If you measured the fuel moisture, you go out and you measure it, the water content's always the same. You measure it from one time period to the other, and during the early time period, it's a little bit lighter than it is during the second time period when it's a little heavier. Well, lo and behold, it makes it look like the moisture content is going down, even though the absolute amount of water in the fuel is the same. That is quite perplexing. So basically what we're trying to do is figure out what's going on with this. How do we decompose? How do we find a metric that is not necessarily water related, but that is directly related to the flammability of the plant during this period? So John walked through some of what we did, but we basically, some of the other things that, just filling in for what John described, is we measured several things about the fuel that we haven't measured before. So moisture content is a common metric that everybody has used, and people have monitored it for decades in certain places consistently. But we also extended that measurement with measurements of particle density, so that the density actually tells us essentially the mass of a particular pine needle is relative to its volume. And that's important because it's a standardized metric that allows us to look at how the weight of the needle is changing throughout a season without regard to how much water is in it. Our chemistry measurements give us ways of partitioning out the chemistry of the fuel into into pretty broad categories. So things like what it's made up of, cellulose and hemicellulose, lignin, but also things we haven't considered before, like the byproducts of photosynthesis, so sugars and starches, and then the things that protect the needle from losing water. All those things are quantified in chemistry. And the last thing is our ignitability metric. And so we have an open flame burner. It's premixed propane. It would cook a mean hamburger, but it is incredibly intense fire. And basically, if we can heat up pine needles to ignition in about generally about 6 seconds. Traditional studies that have actually used other apparatuses to study ignition on needles or anything similar have a heating rate that's generally about a tenth or 100th of that. So that rapid heating is really important because one of the things that we know is that the needle itself doesn't actually have to be completely heated up all the way through to ignite. So basically you can think about, like, it's quite analogous to burning a log. You don't have to heat the whole log up to ignition. You just have to heat the surface up to ignition. Well, the faster we heat it, the more that becomes apparent. So, but that rapid heating gives us something that's really realistic in terms of a wildland fire, a wildland flame, which we can't get otherwise. And so one of the things we'll talk about too is just this, these FIRETEC simulations. We have a partnership with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and they have a three-dimensional fire behavior model that basically allows us to create three-dimensional trees and burn them in a computer. But it tells us a lot about the fluid flow within the burning zone, and it allows us to standardize things so that we can hold certain things constant and only vary the things that we're interested in to really try to understand how what we've learned here might affect a real fire. And the last thing we're really trying to get to is predictive tools that allow us to look at when the timing of this dip happens in terms of what are the climatic drivers and then what's the expected fire behavior. So if we look at the results from our first year, we see pretty much exactly what we would have expected from Van Wagner's paper. So these are from John's sampling site, and we see the dip increasing or decreasing, bottoming out right around early May, and then recovering. And we see it happen for both species, for red pine and jack pine. More pronounced actually in jack pine than red pine. But again, we see this trough happen right at the same time as the emergence of new needles. So here's your plant physiology lesson. Number one. New needles on a tree are basically a net sink of carbon, which means that for them to start flushing and growing, they have to be fed carbon from somewhere else in the plant. The easiest place for that carbon to come from is from the old needles that are adjacent to it that are already growing. So imagine what happens here. As this time period starts, we see it sort of flat and then it goes way down. That is actually the tree breaking dormancy. So as the tree breaks dormancy, around here, snow melts, tree breaks dormancy, there's this period of time where new needles aren't flushed yet, but the trees are growing. They're actively photosynthesizing, right? Well, what they do, which I think is pretty fascinating, is they actually accumulate carbon in the needles during that time period from dormancy to the flushing of new needles. They accumulate carbon. That carbon is stored such that when the new needles emerge, they can give that energy to the new needles to grow. So during this time period, what's happening, and we'll show you that in a minute, is that they're basically supercharging on energy, which they're getting ready to give up to new needles so that the new needles can have a successful life. All of that means that there is a tremendous amount of biomass being accumulated in a tree canopy, and you can't see it. So in this case, if we look at the foliar density, the foliar density starts out at about 0.4, but it goes up to, it actually increases by about 30% during the dip period, which means that the tree is growing and storing all of that energy in the needles and just waiting for the new needles to need it. And as soon as they flush and it gives that energy up, then it actually, you see the recovery means that, if you remember our equation before, it's water mass over dry weight. Well, if you increase the dry weight, so it's on the bottom of that equation, increasing the dry weight makes the moisture content look like it's going down. And vice versa, if you decrease the dry weight, it makes the moisture content look like it's going up. Well, what happens here is that the moisture content looks like it's going down because the needles are getting heavier. And then as the needles start giving up that biomass to the new needles, it actually starts to recover again because the needles get lighter. Well, so that's what the density curve shows us. So we see this, the needles increasing in density and peaking out right about the time that the typical dip is at its maximum, and then we see it tail off again. Now all this happens right before the emergence of new needles. Well, if we look at the chemistry to see what's happening, we see that several things are happening all at once, actually, or pretty close to all at once, that really are pretty important. One, so the one thing that happens as the tree breaks dormancy is that it starts to accumulate starch. So basically, during dormancy, the needles have pretty much 0% starch. They have none. And then as spring progresses, and before new needles have emerged, they have actually changed and they've accumulated as much as almost 15% of their dry weight in starch. If you are a marathon runner, maybe not a marathon runner, maybe a sprinter, and you want energy fast, what do you go for? Sugar, right? Simple, the simpler, the better. So imagine what's happening here is if you walk out and look at a tree in pure dormancy, and then you come back 3 weeks later and you look at that tree again after it's broken dormancy, but nothing has physically changed. But the biomass of that tree is actually increased by 30%. And you can't see it. That means that the energy content of that tree is also increased proportionally. But it's in a form that is easily broken down and can support, essentially provide energy for fires very rapidly. That's kind of important. So basically, we have this time period where the starches are up by 15%. Lots of things are happening in the plant. When the new needles emerge, the new needles are dominated by their own development. So we know what happens when a new needle flushes. They come out, they're nice, pretty green. They get a little longer, they get a little longer, they get a little darker, Well, that getting darker means that they're becoming chemically more complex. So they're developing secondary cell walls, but more importantly, they're putting on a cuticle. And that cuticle helps protect them from losing water. Well, all of this crude fat increase is a function of them actually developing that cuticle over time and hardening and being ready to overwinter. And to essentially to be ready to start this process again the next year for another new batch of needles. But what we see also is the sugar content of the new needles. It increases over time and actually dips for the old needles when the old needles are peaking in starch. So one of the things that's really interesting to me is just again, a historical perspective, is that when we talk about fire and you look and you read fire studies, everything that's ever been published almost has focused on what is the chemistry of wood. Well, maybe this has been our failing point all along, is that we haven't tried to recognize what makes a green plant different from just plain old wood. But if we look at the difference, this is just for Douglas fir as an example, but wood is basically 95 or more percent hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. That's basically just all fiber. That's why we like it, right? We can build houses out of it. We can use it for building materials. Well, a live plant, the needles from a live plant, actually only have about 30% of their chemistry in common with wood, which means that 70% of the stuff that makes up a living needle we've never actually considered as a main source of anything that makes flames, which is also pretty important. So we see this little wedge here. There's things that are in needles that aren't in anything else. This is almost an extreme example, but this is for a Douglas fir needle. Douglas fir needles are actually 35% simple sugar. So if they didn't have all the tannins, they'd be delicious, right? You just eat them. You know, walking around the woods, you wouldn't even have to carry anything with you. You just eat them off the branch. And you can eat them early in the season before they get all tanniny, but and they are delicious. I would recommend you try it. but the point is that this sort of sugar aspect of fuel seems trivial, but when you think about our reference to the human body, if you want energy fast, the easiest energy that you can get is from simple sugar. Well, fire is going to work the same way. Combustion is going to work the same way. It turns out that that sugars require about half the energy to volatilize than cellulose, and that it also happens at a lower temperature. So the combination of these things means that essentially the presence of sugar pushes the whole envelope of when a fire can happen down to happening faster and at a lower temperature. So this period of time during the dip that is absolutely dominated by chemistry and has very little to do with the actual water content of the fuel is really an interesting phenomenon, because it is compacted into this area where this dynamic of sugar and starch really matters. So just as an example of where things happen, and sort of a summary, is this is our live fuel moisture content measurements. This is the dip. The green line is the dip. So we can see that our lowest part of the dip corresponds to almost our highest measured density, but it corresponds to the absolute highest measured starch content, and also to the lowest measured time to ignition. And we'll get into our ignition measurements here in just a second. So, but more simply, that what we found is that the total foliar starch, sugar, and crude fat explains about 86%, or accounts for 86% of the variation in the density, which means that the density variations that we showed in that graph were totally driven by these three chemical components. And we also found that basically, due to the fact that you can't separate the two, that density and moisture content are almost naturally related to each other. And that's because so think about it this way. If you have a round dowel with a known number of voids, and you fill all those voids up with water, and that dowel has a known density that you can calculate. If you take out a number of those voids, then you don't have anywhere to put the water. But you have a dowel with a higher density. So until eventually you have something that has no pores in it and no place to hold water. Well, density and moisture content are related in the same way. There's no way to separate the two because they have to be related. But what we found is that basically the foliar density and the foliar water content, when we just calculate it as a percent of the fresh weight, is nearly identical. And but one of the interesting things that we get once we get into it is the flammability test. So traditional combustion theory says that that if you increase the particle density, you increase the time to ignition. And that's because it's going to take more energy to heat whatever it is you're heating up to get it to ignition temperature. So you can imagine the difference between trying to ignite a hardwood or something like a pine. That's not a stretch to see the difference between how those two things ignite. What we found is exactly the opposite, which is really interesting in itself, and that is that as the foliar density increases, the time to ignition decreased for both pine species. So that means that pines are more flammable at higher density. And this goes back to what we were talking about before. We know the drivers of higher density are from the increase in starch during the dip period. We know that the starch itself is more easily volatilized and easier to generate energy from to support flames. And it also leads to a higher measured density. And so essentially, this increase in density with a decrease in time to ignition is opposite of what we would have expected but is fairly intuitive given that we know what the drivers of density are. One of the things that we're able to do with the project too is to be opportunistic. And so we had in 2013 the Gurman Road fire, which was on May 14th, I think. And this was during a time where we were measuring everything already. And by we, I mean John. I want to make sure that we get that clear. And we measured things in the lab, but not nearly to the extent of what he had to go through in misery. But we were able to grab samples from that fire for both jack pine and red pine, and we found that basically the red pine was probably at a minimum during its dip period, so 90% moisture content, 93% for jack pine, but it had 13% starch and 11% in jack pine, and so that happens to correspond to right up here at these peaks for both species. So it's going to matter, and it could matter a lot. If we go a little farther and we start looking at some of the results from last year, we see pretty much consistent results across a couple of our other samples. So with Rome here and Bemidji, so the needle density, again, we see this, we see the kind of peak and trough for both species at both sites. And again, we see this sort of increasing density with needle age from the new needles. So the little cross hatches are for the new needles and the dots are for the old needles. And then if we look at the time to ignition, we see that, again, our lowest time to ignitions always happen during that dip period. So it's so we are adding like true lab verification of this, even though that it seems trivial, but being able to show that, yes, even at the needle scale, we see changes in flammability throughout the season. That is a big deal. Because it could be anything. You know, it could not have anything to do with the trees themselves. It could have everything to do with how dry the surface fuels are. But the fact that we can sample green trees and test the flammability over time and see these seasonal variations clearly is important. So, and if we look at the starch content for the sites, we see the same peak. So again, this is all the way up to 15% for jack pine, and then almost 15% for red pine, and peaking at actually a little bit less for the jack pine and Bemidji, and then almost the same high value for red pine and Bemidji. You'll notice that this timing is actually, I was actually shocked because it happened at almost exactly the same time, and I was still not sure exactly why. But the one thing that this whole study has taught me is how narrow and how fast this happens. It is that transition from dormancy into this time of peak fire potential, and the transition out of that peak fire potential into a time of more benign fire activity is very dynamic. And obviously it's going to happen as the growing season progresses from the south to the north. And we'll talk about how that works in just a second.
Just a comment there. Going back to the Grimman Road samples, when we talked on the phone the morning of that fire, a little anecdote here, before it had burned, and it was you, me, and Jim Bernier would have a conference call. I had sent you samples about 3 days earlier. And then by the end of the day, Grimman Road happened, and we took some samples, and you measured those, and you said you were shocked by the 3-day difference. I think you said 25% increase in flammability in just 3 days. So help me to explain a little bit what happened up there in the north that day. And northern Minnesota had a big one going on that same day as well.
I think the direct correlation, well, it might be something to look at, is in Minnesota, the snow melt goes from the southeast to the north, or southwest to the northeast. So a lot of times, the Red River Valley is actually snow-free about the same time, say, St. Cloud or even Twin Cities is. And Bemidji is only about 60, 80 miles from that North Dakota, or that prairie forest border. And so that might have something to do with the phenology that's going on there.
Yeah, I noticed that there was almost like a, yeah, I'll show you the maps when we get there, but it's really pretty interesting because it's not this steady northward progression that you would think happens. It's almost like it comes essentially from the southwest. It moves in from the southwest and then moves up from the true south together. So, but again, you know, these the starch concentrations seem to be very consistent across the sampling sites. And still have a lot to learn though, I think. But if we look at the ignition test for both for Bemidji and Rome, we see the same thing that we saw before, is essentially that as the density increases, the time to ignition decreases. And these aren't really small differences. You'll notice that these are essentially half. So it means that if you heat up the same needle, it takes half as much time to burn it under when it has this spring dip low moisture content than something comparable to a new needle. So so let's shift gears a little bit and let's start burning numerical trees. So FIRETEC is a computational fluid dynamics simulation. It's the same thing that they use to simulate airflow over a wing to look at pressure differences, and it's the same technology. They use it to simulate all sorts of large-scale fluid flow. But they've adapted a couple of these models to actually be used for wildland fire. And they're probably the most likely future for all kind of fire modeling. You can't run them. The model itself has to be run on a supercomputer at Los Alamos National Lab. You can't run them on your laptop. But we can learn a lot about fire by using these tools for what they're good at, and that is to be numerical simulation, meaning that we can design a set of experiments just like we would do outside. But we can do it on a computer that says we want to keep everything constant except for the thing that we're most interested in. And by doing that, we can narrow down we can eliminate a lot of the sources of variability and see what the impact of these changes are on the actual fire behavior. So what we did is set up a set of paired experiments. So we took the measured values for particle density. We just did red pine for these, but we took a dormant needle density and a spring dip needle density. And from the dormant moisture content and density, we figured out what the absolute mass of water in a tree canopy would be during that time. And we said, okay, well, we're gonna apply that same mass of water to the second simulation, which is when we increase the needle density to the peak of the dip conditions. But the simulations have exactly the same water content. So that we're not assuming that because the measured fuel moisture dips, that's reflecting a change in the amount of water. So all the results that I'm going to show you actually have more water content in them than they would have if we'd have assumed that the moisture was the cause of the dip. So we have paired simulations, which are dormant and dip conditions, and we do it over a range of canopy cover conditions and canopy bulk density conditions, and 2 wind speed scenarios. So we have 36 simulations basically that give us a range of conditions that can help us understand what the potential impacts of these dip conditions are. So from that we calculate standard metrics of fire behavior, but specifically rate of spread, intensity, burned area. Well, we have some interesting things that are maybe not so intuitive we'll share. But this is what it looks like, which is pretty cool. But so this fire on the left is for a bulk density of 0.22 and a canopy cover of 30% under a low wind speed scenario. And the fire on the right is actually exactly the same everything except trees simulated with a higher needle density. The fire burned twice the area in the same amount of time. Some of the things that were really important is that increase in needle density generates more energy per unit area, which helps fires span across gaps that it could not span across without that extra energy pulse. So our first set of simulations, the lowest canopy cover, the lowest bulk density, under the dormant conditions, didn't propagate as a crown fire. But as soon as we changed it to reflect the needle density during the dip, all of a sudden those fires actually propagated as crown fires when they wouldn't before. Other things that are important, the energy release of the fires always increased as a function of increasing the needle density. And that's because you have more mass per unit area, which means that the heat content of the fuel is actually, the upper limit of that heat content of the fuel is pretty static. It varies a little bit, but if we know what that's going to be. So, but we know that the fuel per unit volume is dynamic, so it means it's going to generate more energy. Less intuitive, actually, so let me back up one. Under these lower density cases, lower canopy cover or lower bulk density, the rate of spread of these fires actually increased in some cases by about 60%. So they spread 60% faster. They always release more energy. But under high density cases, we see that they don't necessarily spread faster. But again, they always release more energy. And that's because that as when a fire is propagating, if only the head is well developed and it doesn't have well developed flanks, the head is being pushed by a dominant wind. But what can also happen is that air can be entrained in along the edges of the flaming front. So air can come in this way, and then be fed by the wind that's blowing behind it. Well, if you take that flame and you bend it, then all of a sudden the air that's entraining in from the sides is blocked, and the whole fire dynamics change. This fire is still releasing a lot more energy, but it actually slows down, which is kind of interesting because it no longer has the ability to entrain air into the head of the fire because the flanks are blocking the entrainment of air into that fire. And so you can actually see the fire change. And it is fairly intuitive to once you think about it a little bit. But so that's the cool thing about these simulations is that they're modeling the fluid flow. So they're modeling the buoyancy that's induced by the flaming front, so that all the air that's being pushed up. They're modeling all the air that's being entrained in to feed that flame. And you can see the difference, so, is that basically the higher the density, the more that the fire essentially flanks, the more that it has energy to push out in addition to forward. And that is a pretty important thing in terms of how it determines the dynamics of the fire. So again, we know that the dip conditions can affect the fire spread in a lot of different ways. One is that in these low canopy conditions, low canopy cover, low bulk density, there's a threshold behavior where the dip means the difference between whether or not a crown fire will propagate at all. And then the higher the density of the tree cover or the bulk density of the foliage, the more it becomes a balance between the energy release, the sort of shape of the flaming front, and all those things matter. So increasing up to 60% by rate of spread, but these threshold behaviors are really important, and just a change in the behavior of the fire itself. So how well developed the head of the fire is versus the flanks, and all of the components of that fire are all things that we learn from these things. So one of the things that the sort of holy grail of all of this is, how do we put it together in a way that gives us a predictive tool? And so early on, Van Wagner published this this figure, which he calls the crown spread factor, and it's based on his foliar moisture effect that he published around the same time. But basically, it says that we can expect our crown fire spread to increase to some maximum during the trough of the dip, and then decrease down to some normal value. Well, now we're in this condition where we have this metric, this foliar moisture content metric. It's not necessarily as meaningful as we really want it to be. So whether or not we should be using it to develop a tool is something else. But we know that starch content, that this increase in starch content is determined from photosynthesis. And that is that we know that when a tree breaks dormancy, it starts to accumulate the carbon. And as that carbon accumulates, the needles get heavier, more energy laden, and essentially more volatile. Well, then maybe the right solution is to find a metric that's best related to photosynthesis and tie that metric into when the dip happens. So we have a model that actually predicts green up. But it also predicts the timing of break in dormancy, so even before green up. And the cool thing about it is that if we take some of John's data, some strange thing happened here, but it's okay. So underlying here, the gray line is actually the growing season index. The growing season index is calculated from weather data that we can derive from our raw stations. It's very simple. It uses basically a metric of humidity, a metric of, well, it uses minimum daily air temperature and photoperiod or day length. And it combines those three metrics together to basically estimate when dormancy breaks, which is when this number starts increasing, and then when the peak of green up is, or the peak growing season is. Well, what you'll notice is that this increase right here corresponds to an increase in the relative fire behavior observed during that time period, until you get to a point where generally we use the metric of 50 for when green up happens. And it turns out that it's fairly general. Seems kind of crazy, but it does work. So you'll notice that if you draw this line across here and you go up, that just so happens to correspond to the time every year that fire activity starts tailing off. So the ability to have a weather metric that could and can and is related to the processes that are actually driving the dip is a pretty powerful thing. But it means you can possibly turn it into a tool that will allow us to predict it. But if you look at 2013, for example, how clean this is. So we break dormancy, and then we hit this 50 mark, and it's like the switch turns off. So it is, so being able to make this step, to go from not thinking about this as a water process, but thinking about this as an energy process, is a totally different way of approaching this problem. But it gives us the ability to look at it in a different way. So what we did is we take all of John's data that he showed before, which, by the way, is about the best, most useful thing ever in terms of recording fire behavior. So John showed you the graph of where every day they basically record the worst observed fire behavior on their unit for that day. It goes up to where their crown fire activity happens and where their erratic fire behavior happens. Well, I just took that data for the whole time period, and I calculated our growing season index, and I calculated 10-hour fuel moisture. I rescaled the 10-hour fuel moisture between the minimum and maximum, so that 100 is the highest recorded fuel moisture ever, and 0 is the lowest. And then that puts the fuel moisture and the growing season index on the same scale. And then if you plot it, lo and behold, all of the crown fire activity happens when the fuel moistures are in the lower 20% and the growing season index is less than 50. And Cottonville, which, thanks to my lovely central Wisconsin tour yesterday, we got to go see, which was awesome. Maybe a little anticlimactic, but given the fact that it's now a big pivot ag area. But, so the Cottonville fire happened right here. And this red is where all the crown fire activities happen. So imagine being able to map this for the lake states. Well, lo and behold, we can. And that's what this little map does. This is the growing season index that we calculate from real-time weather data gridded across the country. So this is kind of starting from last year, just to illustrate what a progression looks like. But you'll see basically pure dormancy in the northern part of the state. But you'll see, that the southeast is already well in their growing season, and if we kind of move through, we see that in April, mid-April, we start to see this dormancy break. It is not consistent across the whole. It is not consistent north to south, nor is it consistent east to west. So it's really important to capture these kind of variations. And most of these variations, actually all of these variations, can be mapped just with minimum temperature. It doesn't even take anything really fancy. So if you know the minimum temperature, you can map these progressions pretty easily. So we see April 13th, we see the southern part of the state in this 30%, so approaching that kind of peak time. So this is should be roughly the 50% threshold. And then we see April 27th, again, we're right at the peak. And then we see the 5-4, when again, we're starting green up in the south, and then we're right at the middle part of the threshold in the central part of the state. and still later in the northern part. And then by May 12th, we're kind of pushing the limit in the northern part. So the reason I show you that is because where we're getting, and this is, it's been an incremental effort, and that is to step back, reanalyze, rethink how we frame this problem. We now know that it's probably directly tied to photosynthesis, and that we need to start thinking about it in terms of how weather affects the photosynthesis of living plants. And from that, we can actually use that to develop these mapping tools or predictive tools that give us a better idea of when this potential is, and that could possibly be that tool that says, yes, today is that day. So one of the things that to keep in mind that we've talked about through the whole thing is that foliar moisture content really has two components. So the water content of the fuel really matters. There's no doubt that it matters, because we know that from trying to burn a wet campfire, it does matter. But we know that the actual things that burn come from the dry matter of the fuel. So all the factors that affect the dry matter of the fuel affect the probability that fuel will ignite and release energy. The chemistry of that fuel has an impact on the heat content of the fuel itself, and then also on the fuel's density. But both of these things together really influence their ignitability, but most importantly, the effective heat yield. So how much net energy does a fire generate that allows that fire to preheat something next to it and enable that fire to propagate? So that's really what we're trying to do, is decompose these pieces and understand what drives all of this cycle. So what drives actual changes in the foliar water content versus what drives these changes in the dry matter? Because essentially the place that we're not at yet is really describing how much impact these chemical changes have on the rate of decomposition of the fuel. So how fast does a pine needle burn when it has a whole lot more starch in it than it would during a pure dormancy condition? But that's down the road a little bit, but really where we're trying to get to. So basically we know that our highest observed needle flammability was during the dip, and we saw that from actually both of our the full suite sampling sites, and the dip was driven by changes in the foliar density. The density is correlated primarily to the sugar, starch, and crude fat content, and really that if the total volume of the fuel stays the same, and this happens during the springtime period, you have more available fuel than the same volume, which means that the heat release of that fuel is going to be a lot higher. So with that, we'll just talk now. Anybody have any questions?
Sean, one comment, as you're saying that about the density of the fuel, it's almost, just to throw a thought experiment out there, it's like you have a bullet and you have a measure of gunpowder that you put in the bullet. If you pour that gunpowder out and you light it off, it just goes, put it in the bullet hole, it goes pop.
Yep, it's all very contained too, and it's tightly packed. It's the same, very much the same idea.
I got a few questions.
Yeah.
Well, first off, one of which is you talked about utilizing the photo day, or the day, how did you term it?
Photo period.
Photo period. Is that based on solar radiation, or is it just based on just length of day?
So that's a good question, actually. Right now it's based on the length of the day. But the thing that we noticed actually is that we're gonna have to go back to actual measured solar radiation, is that since this is a photosynthesis problem, clear days have a much bigger impact than cloudy days, because it's all about how much sunshine these things are getting during the springtime, which means that these sunnier, clearer springtime days means that the plants are going to accumulate more than they would if it was cloudy. So what we have is the same logic driven by actual solar radiation, so that we could actually look at the day-to-day fluctuations and see if it correlates back to some of the kind of anomalous drops. Because we saw some, like we'd have a dip period and then a couple of measurement periods and then go back down again. And it's most likely because you get clear days and it's like supercharging on those clear days, and then the cloud cover knocks it back down. So that's why I think this has always been a hard problem, is because it matters. Like that period of, that springtime period, the daily weather conditions are going to matter a lot, because if it's really cool, and then all of a sudden it just gets hot and everything greens up, then it's not the same thing as having a true spring where you break dormancy and you have, you know, a few weeks of this accumulation period with some clear days where they can really basically accumulate a lot of energy.
The other one is one more after this. The modeling from FIRETEC, where you talked about the spread rates were no faster because of the bending of the flame length, and the wind couldn't get behind it fast enough to keep it going, and it would just stay the same spread rate constant. One of the things from a firefighter safety perspective, if you think about it, we know things aren't constant when we're working out there. And so if you have a wind shift, wind change, that spread rate could increase dramatically just because now it has that flush of oxygen. So, I mean, even though it may look, you know, continuous and the same, things can change very rapidly based on that. So when you did that modeling, which is consistent, you know, you were doing it for a very good reason, but when we look at reality, that's going to have a real huge, and it would be a good note to put in there, that, you know, that's not reality. Of course, that's doing it to determine spread rates, but it actually is inflammability, but the actuality is it can have a real good impact on how things can change very quickly.
Well, one of the things with flanking behavior is that, you know, so if you have a sustained wind from one direction, and if you had a narrow head on a fire, and then all of a sudden the wind changed, the wind wouldn't have anything to blow against. So when you have well-developed flanks, and the wind shifts direction, all of a sudden it still has a head to blow that's already established, and the fire can move faster in another direction. So whereas it, you know, which is exactly what you're saying, is that it essentially contributes to more, you know, the potential for more erratic behavior, because the well-developed flanks give the fire more leeway to move in any direction without losing energy. So, you know, whereas with a narrow head fire that isn't well developed on the flanks, then when the wind is blowing on it this way, then it's blowing directly on it. But as soon as it blows off this way, there is no developed flank for it to blow it into another direction. So,
and then your greenness factor, your map that you did just showed was the end there. You said it was based off grids, RTMAs. Is that correct?
yeah.
I'm looking for the grid values. So then we can put it in practicality. We could throw it into our per station and, you know, our weather stations, and we can actually throw those grid values in there, and then that would be another useful tool to develop staffing perspectives on the field.
So we have this, the index built into WIMS now.
Yeah.
It's going to be, it's in test, and it'll be rolled over into production next week. So you can get that value, you can calibrate it by station, you can get it right. It'll calculate it for all stations.
And WIMS though?
But you can get another, I know you don't like WIMS. But the point is that it'll be there as part of the standard calculations because it's gonna be used to replace the live fuel moisture modeling in a DRS. So, because it's terrible. Anything could be better than terrible.
Models are always wrong.
Some are useful though. Yeah.
With everything, the scientific data that you're getting back when you're testing and stuff, have you noticed or have you studied the samples themselves, specifically old growth, older trees versus younger trees, branches? When I've been taking this information over, to test the samples themselves, every once in a while there would be, the numbers are kind of, they're not consistent. If we take 3 samples of each species, and they're not consistent. And then after a while, I kind of noticed, well, gee, it's the old, I cut it off this tree, and I cut it off that tree, and then another tree. There seems to be a little bit of variation within, like I say, if it's an older, red pine that's 10, 12 inches versus a 5-inch red pine tree. Have you noticed anything from that standpoint?
Yeah, and one of the things that happens with when trees actually get too old is their photosynthetic capacity kind of declines with age, and it's probably very related to that. Okay. So that decline in the rate of photosynthesis, but also the 2 species are very different. So jack pine and red pine have very different photosynthetic rates too. So, it most likely is going to be mostly related to that change in the photosynthetic activity as they get older. But there probably are some age-related differences, but it's hard to tell what the main drivers are because in some cases, if you were to sample from a sunlit versus a shaded side of the tree, you could get vastly different answers. So, the size of the sample you'd have to take to stratify across all of the potential sources of variation is very hard. So you just have to accept being wrong a little bit.
I was gonna say, that's kinda, I think what's maybe is going on with that jack pine and Bemidji is, number one, we had a cold, wet spring, so we had a lot of cloud cover. There are some taller Norway in this plantation we were using, and so that could be another part of the factor, and it's majority Norway with renegade jack pine in it. So we might look for a little more pure jack pine staying nearby to get the jack pine out of it.
Yeah, because it's definitely going to matter if they're overtopped at all, or if they're basically competing for sunlight. Yeah.
So when you're measuring the live moisture content, is it possible that when you put this in the oven and you dry it out, you're also drying out all sorts of other volatile compounds? So you're measuring loss of volatile compounds and water?
No, not. The reason that, usually not. And it's because you dry it at a relatively low temperature. So that most of the mass of the needle gets volatilized at temperatures like above 300 C or higher. So that, but even some of the low temperature volatiles, it's still like 140. So we usually dry things in that 95, like right around the boiling point of water, so that we can drive off the water but not drive off anything else. But anything else that gets driven off, anything that is volatilized is a really tiny amount of the fuel. But it's a good question because if you heat it up under too high of a temperature, you're essentially driving off 2 things. You're driving off mass of the needle and water, which is what you don't want. So we usually try to restrict our temperature to that fairly narrow range so we just get rid of the water, and we're pretty confident we're not driving off anything else. Yeah.
Would you be able to, it might be a little bit easier to flip back to a slide for me, the one slide that has fire behavior overlaid with the growing, I would call it growing degree date, but
That,
that one, right, that, right there.
yeah,
Everything that we're piecing, or that you guys are piecing together as far as correlating the spring dip, you know, with the starch, I follow all that. What I'm looking at, my question is so in the spring dip, we're thinking it's more of a starch thing than a water thing. When I look at 2012, is it a moisture thing compared to a starch thing during the summer?
No. Oh, well, 2000.
In 2012 specifically during the summer?
Well, 2012, just a comment, 2012 and 13 are a great study in contrast. 2012 was a droughty summer, and Matt, that your growing season index, as I recall, it measures drought stress.
it does, yeah.
So 2012 was a lower value on that growing season index.
You can see it drop.
Because it was so dry. That was, remember, it was 2 months of hot, dry weather. We
Mhm.
didn't have hardly any precip. And so that's seen there. And then in the spring, we had a real dry, real hot stretch in March. Then it got cold.
Yeah.
And then we got that real hot
What
summer.
this is.
Yeah, right there. And 2013 was just wet.
So I didn't know if there was any speculation on that,
I
if by
think-
chance during the summer months in the Great Lakes, if it's potentially, if it is a moisture thing then,
So I think this
where the
is,
starches are staying constant. I know this isn't the focus today, but it's just interesting.
I think it has to be part of it. I mean, you know, that there's clearly a time where the availability of the canopy fuels is like chemically mediated, you know, it's because we have this set of conditions that make them highly flammable. And it happens at a time where the surface fuels are available, where it's actually dry enough for things to burn. The summertime, the thing we can't get to quite yet is that if you step out of the spring dip condition, which is driven by something else, once you have the needles flush and then they harden, everything's pretty close to the same. But we still have essentially have available canopy, and then we have an increase in the sugar content of the new needles, such that where the needles are hardened, they're more available, have lower moisture content, but we know that that's not as meaningful as a metric. But then you have the available surface fuels, which is probably the main driver of the summertime season. And I think we're seeing that even here, where we have this sort of unusual dot, which is where we're in this sort of running and spotting fire potential when the live fuel index is up here at 80. And when you're above 50, you're already greened up. When you're between 50 and 100, it means you're like almost the peak of your canopy cover, peak growing season conditions. But you know, when you drop back down from that peak, like we were showing these drops are actually pretty meaningful because they indicate summer water stress. And they're telling you these time periods where it's just really hot and dry during the summer, which may not be normal. So, and you can see that the maximum for that year was actually lower than any other year too, which means that it was pretty dry and pretty hot.
The only reason I asked the question is because you were talking about on that previous chart as far as that threshold of 50, I think you're saying, where anything below that it was basically green up, I think you were talking.
Basically dormant below.
Or below, yeah, okay, dormant.
Yeah.
But then,
And that's kind of on that increasing side. So once you get, you know, you start out at essentially 0, to follow the scale, starts out at 0 and then increases up to, up to 100 is the maximum. And then back down to dormancy again in the fall. And this 50 line would be your growing season, this little zone up here.
okay.
Have you researched at all the content of the candles itself, of taking a sample of the candle on the new growth, the content of the pollen on the needle for more volatility or less?
We did, a couple of things, well, not for this, I shouldn't say, but we did some studies with lodgepole pine candles, particularly the reproductive organs, basically. And they were definitely not flammable and not volatile at all. They were like almost the opposite. So that's probably, but it, you know, the one thing we didn't get into is we've been trying to also tie it back to the phenology, you know, just as using the phenology as an indicator of when that happened too. So like the visible indicators of when you can see things. And, but yeah, it seems like that it's probably mainly to do with the old needles.
We, from Michigan, and we dried needles in mile for years and years. And it's certainly a correlation of the length of the candle. And, you know, once that is maxed, then the needle moistures are going up, less fire. But also the days since rain, you know, if we have a stretch of 6-7 days no rain in that period, obviously the more starts the problem fires as well. Regardless if it's springtime or in the middle of the summer, it's days since rain is a big factor for us.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to be the driving factor of all the, you know, of the same kind of thing with the fine fuel moisture is they're going to be heavily correlated with each other. But it definitely is one of those things where it's two pieces, where you got to have an available canopy, but you have to be able to support fire. And, you know, if it's too wet, you just can't support fire. And it doesn't matter how severe the canopy fuel conditions are, because you're just not going to start a fire. But I definitely think that, you know, metrics like the day since rain are probably going to be good, solid indicators of the, you know, the sort of fuel moisture, surface fuel conditions. So, yeah.
So I kind of been thinking about this in terms of the peak of the density. If you took the dried needles and basically tried to do an ignition test on those, you'd almost expect them to explode. Just thinking this probably would be the most flammable thing you can possibly get. And then it kind of got me thinking, well, what if that wasn't necessarily the case if you drew that out over time? What if you were to ignite the dry needles and they didn't follow that same dip pattern? I guess, what would that tell us about the content of water that is in the needles and what effect that has on the actual ignition during those times?
One of the problems with drying them out and igniting them is just the fact that all dry needles ignite really fast. We'd have to heat them up really slow to see the difference, and then we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. We wouldn't really know what the drivers are, because now we'd be heating them up so slowly that they wouldn't be representative of the same conditions.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking of it in terms of that period of time, there's a relative water content that is somewhere between completely dry and completely saturated, but how much that fluctuation of the relative water content has on the actual ignition.
Well, John did relative water content measurements the first year, which you take a needle and you actually basically soak it in water. And you say how much, so that gives you what's called a turgid weight. Tells you how much water the needle can hold. And then you weigh it fresh before you soak it in water, and then you dry it out. And you can actually calculate the percent of saturation of the needle. And it turns out that during the dip period that the relative water content was actually increasing, which means that there's actually more, that the trees were actually more hydrated.
Yeah, and I remember that part of it, that's kind of one of these other thoughts that got in my head, well, for increasing relative water, but we're still seeing the increase in fire behavior, where we see that. And I kind of figured, like what you said, that dry needles are basically gonna explode, so it'd be very hard to make that correlation.
So one of the things we are doing is we're trying to get support to get a piece of test equipment that'll allow us to heat up these fuel particles in a purged environment so they don't burn, but they thermally degrade over temperature ranges. And we can actually see if the thermal degradation happens at a lower temperature during this time. So basically means that it can happen faster. It doesn't have to be heated up as much before it starts to break down. And whether or not the rate changes. And if we can do that, then we'll be able to actually see, we'll be able to plot and show the difference in the actual rate of pyrolysis, or the rate of generation of flammable gases from the fuel during the springtime versus during dormancy. And that would change this picture a lot, because we wouldn't have to guess. We wouldn't have to, like, you know, not really guess. We wouldn't have to, we'd have more a firm foundation for how the things that we're measuring affect real fuel thermal degradation.
So we've had some good fires in like August and stuff in UP. So you're thinking with all, you know, surface fires already, all the fuels are available. So you're thinking, are they maxed out on starches, the new needles, in August, and that could be the contributing factor? Because we're catching a bottoming out again in August on needle moistures. So
yeah, and I think that there are some of those dynamics that we're gonna have to, like, figuring out the dip part is one part, and then, you know, this later season activity is something that's different. But I think it probably has as much to do with the dynamics of the new growth. So that, you know, the new growth flushes and then starts to harden, and then eventually it becomes available too. It's rather than being an impediment to fire spread, it could actually promote and sustain fire spread if things were dry enough. So there is that, you know, that balance where, because even though I say moisture content doesn't matter that much, it matters for new needles. Like the new needles that we got, the very first ones we get, we usually can't even get them to ignite. They just don't burn because they're low quality substrate and they're laden with water. But the longer that they go and the more that they harden, the faster that they ignite. And then when you think about that at the canopy scale, you have this mix of new needles and old needles all the time. Throughout the growing season, and then it has to, basically, they have to get to a point where you could burn them, and that just happens to happen at the end of the summer. So, or, you know, where they've completed their hardening process, and they're pretty much just like old needles, but you remember that they actually also increase in sugar content. So that increase in sugar content means that the canopy scale sugar content is higher too. So they become more available during that time. But yeah, I think there's still probably lots of things to learn there.
By the end of the season, is it, again, about 30% are new needles, 60% are old? And is it almost correlating to what your starch densities are?
I think, well, it depends on the longevity, the needle longevity. So, you know, here, you're not going to have, you have reasonable needle turnover. But for, you know, like for lodgepole pine, for example, we actually see the same dip in lodgepole pine. We've seen it in Douglas fir. It's been measured in sandpine in Florida. It happens everywhere. It's not just here. It's just the alignment of factors here that happen. But the needle longevity is really what determines that the kind of mass balance of the two. So how long, you know, how much of canopy are you growing every year and replacing? so.
Within that, within how long that particular tree holds that needle, are we thought about maybe in the future looking into what the overall canopy looks like? What were the last couple growing seasons? How much nutrients were available on a particular soil, for example, to relate to how much density could be in said canopy? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's where we have to get to, is essentially representing the canopy more dynamically, so that we can say what is the kind of, what does the bulk canopy look like? What is the percentage of new needles and old needles? What stage of development are the new needles in versus the old, and then how, what does that turnover look like? And all that stuff really matters. So, but I think that's really, one of the things we're trying to, one of the directions we want to head.
And then prescribed burning tends to raise that canopy, it actually lessens the canopy. You'll get enough needle scorch on the bottom that, kind of line tails those trees a little bit.
Yeah.
I've got, this might be more for John too. I think we've observed a couple times where we'll get a rain event or something, and we'll see kind of a counterintuitive dip in the moisture content as it shows up. Have you guys kind of discussed that at all? I guess what I'm getting at is, it seems there's some times where we've had some really significant fires that have occurred on the tail end of maybe a 1/10 of an inch of rain or something like that, or snow was that cover was on. So I'm thinking of if that rain actually does more harm than good in some cases by increasing photosynthesis, by increasing starch and sugar content. Is that kind of what?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, so if it were relatively dry, you get a pulse of moisture, and then you get sunshine, and then it's dry for a few days afterwards, enough to dry things out, then, it's all related to, to photosynthesis, and you have to have water and you have to have sunshine. So, yeah, it can matter.
I guess from a fire management standpoint, for a dry period, you got good rain and then went back into clear days and good growing conditions, that would be kind of a start to watch out.
It's almost like you're saying rain's bad.
I want to try to cover it to it, but I guess, yeah.
It's crazy. I know.
I know that in the past, before we were working with Matt, we were looking at the real things that are behind it. I could never find a correlation between precipitation and the measurements. I kept looking for precipitation and temperature. It was never consistent. Because we were barking up the wrong tree. We're looking at moisture, not realizing that it was these density values, which we weren't able to measure, that were really happening, and that was being affected by the precip and sun. We just weren't looking at that.
When you're collecting your fuel samples, does it make much difference time of day, humidity, when you collect your samples as far as your action, when you weigh them, dry them?
It can, but the most important thing is to just pick a time of the day that you can operationally do it, and just do it at the same time. Because collecting way early in the morning could be different than late in the afternoon. But so for plant physiologists, they measure the water potential of plants at pre-dawn, so before the sun is ever up. And that's because they know that over the course of the day that things vary a lot. But that time right before the sun's up is the most stable, because the plant's recovered essentially over the night to whatever it's going to get to. Consistency is always the most important thing, is to just kind of pick a time and say, this is when we're going to do it. And stick with it. So.
Does it matter what size tree, the diameter?
I don't know if we know enough to say that yet, but, I don't really think so. I mean, I know from our other measurements, from measuring, fully mature trees that are, to measuring juvenile trees, there just isn't that much difference between them. So,
Kind of goes upstairs, but, so do you want, it's better to be consistent. If we've been measuring juveniles the whole time, we should just keep measuring juveniles.
yeah, I think, for sampling, one of the most practical things is can you get to it? What's the reasonable height before you can't, you have to go out with a ladder and a hole printer. Just not any fun, so. I think we're pushing our time here, so, I want to thank everybody for sticking in here. And, yeah.